The autumn breeze rustled through the tree-lined streets of Georgetown, carrying the sweet scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee from nearby cafes. It was just another Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C., the kind where government workers rushed between meetings and tourists snapped photos of historic buildings. But for two young teenagers walking home from their prestigious private school, this ordinary day was about to become anything but normal. The siblings walked side by side, their navy blue uniforms neat and pressed, matching backpacks swaying with each step. The older brother adjusted his tie, a habit he'd picked up from watching his father on TV. His younger sister skipped occasionally, still excited about acing her history test. They were discussing their plans for the weekend, their voices mixing with the sounds of passing cars and distant construction. "Mom said we could maybe go to that new ice cream place," the sister said, her eyes lighting up at the thought. Her brother smiled, about to respond, when they noticed a police car slowly cruising down the street. Neither thought much of it. After all, police cars were as common as politicians in this part of town. Officer James Miller sat behind the wheel, his partner Robert Chen scanning the sidewalks. They'd received a call about a convenience store theft 20 minutes earlier. The description was vague at best. Two young people in dark clothes. It wasn't much to go on, but in their eagerness to catch someone, anything seemed suspicious. "Look at those two," Chen said, pointing toward the siblings. "Dark clothes, right age range." Miller nodded, already pulling the car toward the curb. Neither officer noticed the school crest on the teenagers' blazers or the fact that they were walking confidently, not acting suspicious at all. The sound of car doors opening made the siblings turn around. The sister clutched her brother's arm as two officers approached them, hands resting near their belts. The brother felt his heart race but remembered what their father had always taught them: stay calm, be respectful, but know your rights. "Afternoon," Officer Miller called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. A few passers-by slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. Among them was Mrs. Rodriguez, owner of the corner flower shop, who set down her watering can and kept her eyes fixed on the situation. She'd known these kids since they were little, always stopping by to admire her window displays. "We're investigating a theft that occurred nearby," Officer Chen announced, moving to block the siblings' path forward. "Your clothes match the description we received. We're going to need to search your bags." The brother stepped slightly in front of his sister, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Sir, we're just walking home from school. You can see our uniforms." But before he could finish, Officer Miller cut him off. "This won't take long if you cooperate," he said, reaching for the boy's backpack. The sister tried to pull out her phone, but Officer Chen quickly stopped her. "No phones right now," he ordered, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. A small crowd had begun to gather. The owner of the coffee shop across the street stepped outside, phone in hand, quietly recording. The air felt thick with tension as Officer Miller unzipped the first backpack, roughly pulling out textbooks and notebooks, papers spilling onto the sidewalk. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Those are the senator's children," she called out, her voice trembling with indignation. "They walk this route every day after school." But the officers, caught up in their misguided investigation, didn't seem to hear her. The sister's eyes welled with tears as she watched her brother's carefully organized notebooks scattered on the ground. She managed to press one button on her phone before it was taken away, a pre-programmed SOS message to their parents. The whole scene played out under the warm afternoon sun, with the historic Georgetown townhouses standing as silent witnesses. A delivery driver stopped his bike, adding to the growing number of observers. The brother maintained his composure, though his hands shook slightly as he watched the officers rifle through their belongings. Time seemed to slow down in those moments. The gentle autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk, swirling around their feet. The sound of distant sirens grew closer, though these weren't coming for a convenience store theft. The siblings didn't know it yet, but their father had received their message and was already making calls that would shake the entire D.C. Police Department. As Officer Miller reached the bottom of the first backpack, his hand froze. There, attached to a small side pocket, was a distinctive pin, one that every D.C. police officer was trained to recognize. It was an official Senate pin, the kind only given to immediate family members of sitting senators. At that exact moment, his radio crackled to life with an urgent message from dispatch. The world around them was about to change dramatically, but for now, they were just two scared kids being wrongfully searched on their way home from school. The autumn sun continued to shine, the leaves continued to fall, and in 5 minutes, these officers would learn a lesson they'd never forget. Little did anyone know that this moment, captured on dozens of phones and security cameras, would soon become a turning point in the ongoing national conversation about law enforcement practices. But that was still to come. For now, the clock was ticking, and karma was about to arrive in the form of a very angry and very powerful parent. Officer Miller's hands trembled slightly as he continued searching through the backpack, papers and notebooks scattered across the Georgetown sidewalk. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the historic cobblestone street, while the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. The young boy stood tall despite his fear, his private school blazer catching the autumn breeze. His sister, fighting back tears, watched as Officer Chen held her phone just out of reach. The message she'd managed to send to their father now felt like their only lifeline. "Sir," the boy tried again, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "our school IDs are in the front pocket. If you just look." "Quiet," Officer Miller snapped, though something in the boy's composed demeanor made him uncomfortable. These kids weren't acting like typical suspects. They carried themselves differently, spoke differently. But pride and stubborn determination kept him from backing down. Mrs. Rodriguez, the flower shop owner, had now stepped fully onto the sidewalk, her garden shears still in hand. "This is outrageous," she called out, her voice carrying down the street. "I've known these children since they were in elementary school. Their father is—" "Ma'am, please step back," Officer Chen interrupted, holding up his hand. "This is a police matter." More spectators gathered around the scene. A businessman in an expensive suit paused his phone call, frowning at the officer's behavior. Two college students from nearby Georgetown University stopped their conversation mid-sentence, instantly pulling out their phones to record. The owner of the local coffee shop had propped his door open, the smell of fresh espresso mixing with the tension in the air. The sister clutched her navy blue blazer tighter around herself, the school crest catching the light. Her brother's perfectly organized calculus notes now littered the ground, morning dew from the grass seeping into the papers. He'd spent hours on those notes, preparing for next week's exam. "Look at their uniforms," someone in the crowd called out. "They're from the private school of the street." Officer Miller's partner shifted uncomfortably. The growing crowd and their obvious disapproval were making him nervous. These kids were wearing expensive uniforms, carrying top-of-the-line laptops, and speaking with the kind of confidence that came from good upbringing. The original theft report mentioned suspects in street clothes running away from a convenience store. A gentle gust of wind scattered more papers across the sidewalk. The sister took a small step forward to retrieve a falling sheet, but Officer Chen quickly moved to block her path. "Don't move," he ordered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. The boy spoke up again, his tone remarkably composed for someone his age. "Our father always taught us to respect law enforcement," he said carefully, "but he also taught us about our rights. You have no probable cause for the search." Officer Miller paused, taken aback by the teenager's knowledge of legal terminology. Most kids their age wouldn't know to say that. But he'd gone too far to back down now. "If you've got nothing to hide, then this will be over quickly," he replied. Though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. A sleek black government vehicle slowed as it passed the scene, the driver clearly radioing something into his earpiece. Neither officer noticed this detail, too focused on their misguided investigation, but the siblings saw it, and for the first time since this ordeal began, they exchanged a knowing look. Help was coming. Mrs. Rodriguez had pulled out her own phone now, scrolling through her camera roll with shaking hands. "I have pictures of them growing up right here. Their father comes to buy flowers for their mother every Friday. He's a sen." "Ma'am, final warning," Officer Chen cut her off, but his partner had already frozen in place, staring at something he'd just pulled from the backpack's side pocket. The leather wallet had fallen open, revealing not just a student ID, but also a small family photo. In it, the two teenagers stood on the steps of the Capitol building, their father in a familiar pose that anyone who watched the news would recognize. Officer Miller's face went pale. The sister, seeing the officer's reaction, stood up straighter. Despite her youth, she suddenly carried herself with the poise of someone much older. "Our father serves on the Senate Judiciary Committee," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the now hushed street. "He oversees law enforcement oversight." The crowd had grown larger, and whispers spread quickly as people began to recognize the teenagers. Someone mentioned the Senate. Another person pulled up a news article on their phone. The coffee shop owner was already on a call, presumably to a local news station. In the distance, multiple sirens could be heard approaching. Not the usual DC background noise, but sirens getting distinctly closer to their location. Officer Miller and Officer Chen exchanged worried glances, finally beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. The boy reached down to pick up one of his scattered notebooks, and this time neither officer moved to stop him. The power dynamic had shifted, though the teenagers showed no signs of gloating or satisfaction. They simply stood there, dignity intact, waiting for what would happen next. The autumn breeze continued to blow gently down the historic Georgetown street, carrying with it the sound of approaching vehicles and what would soon become a major scandal in the DC Police Department. In just a few more minutes, these officers would learn exactly who they had detained, and the consequences would be felt throughout the entire city. Time seemed to stand still on that Georgetown street as Officer Miller stared at the Senate pin in his trembling hands. The prestigious symbol gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its official markings leaving no doubt about its authenticity. Every police officer in DC knew what this pin meant. It was the kind of identification that opened doors throughout the Capitol, the kind that belonged to the families of the nation's most powerful leaders. The brother and sister watched silently as the reality of the situation dawned on the officers' faces. Their father had always told them that true power wasn't in showing strength, but in maintaining dignity under pressure. Even now, with their belongings scattered across the sidewalk, they stood tall, their private school uniforms a stark contrast to the officers' earlier assumptions. Officer Chen's radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. "All units in Georgetown, be advised." The dispatcher's voice carried a tone that made both officers freeze. "Senator," static cut through the transmission, but the next words came through crystal clear. "Children are to be released immediately." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones capturing every moment. Mrs. Rodriguez, still clutching her garden shears, had tears in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. "I tried to tell you," she said, her voice carrying years of protective affection for the two teenagers she'd watched grow up. "Their father buys my best roses every Friday for their mother's office." The coffee shop owner across the street was now standing on his doorstep, a phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I'm watching it right now," he said to someone on the other end. "Right in front of my shop. The police just searched the senator's kids." Officer Miller's hands shook as he tried to gather the scattered papers, his earlier confidence evaporating with each passing second. These weren't just any teenagers, they were the children of one of the most influential members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the very committee that oversaw law enforcement policies. A sleek black SUV with government plates pulled up to the curb, followed by two more. Men in suits stepped out, their earpieces and badges marking them as federal agents. The boy and his sister relaxed slightly at the familiar sight. They'd grown up around their father's security detail. "Step away from the children," one of the agents commanded, his voice firm but controlled. The officers immediately backed up, their faces pale with the realization of what they'd done. The sister finally allowed herself a small sigh of relief as a familiar face from their father's office approached. "Are you both all right?" the agent asked kindly, having known the siblings since they were small. They nodded, maintaining their composure even as their father's most trusted security advisor began documenting the scene. The growing crowd watched in fascination as more official vehicles arrived. Whispers spread through the onlookers as people began to recognize the significance of what they were witnessing. A local news van had already pulled up at the end of the street, drawn by multiple calls from concerned citizens. "I grabbed all their papers," Mrs. Rodriguez said, carefully holding out the rescued homework assignments and notes. "Some of them got wet from the grass, but maybe they can still be saved." The sister gave her a grateful smile, She'd known the kind florist would always have their back. Officer Miller stood frozen, the Senate pin still in his hand, as his superior officer stepped out of a newly arrived police car. The captain's face was a mask of barely contained fury as he surveyed the scene. He'd spent years building relationships with the Hill, and in 5 minutes, these officers had threatened all of that. The brother finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Our backpacks, please," he said simply, extending his hand. Officer Chen quickly handed them over, avoiding eye contact. The boy methodically began repacking his sister's books first, another lesson from their father about putting family before yourself. More sirens could be heard approaching in the distance. The coffee shop owner had brought out cups of hot chocolate for the siblings, a small gesture of kindness in the aftermath of the ordeal. The sister accepted hers with a quiet thank you, her hands no longer shaking. The federal agents were now taking statements from witnesses while photographing the scene. Mrs. Rodriguez was animatedly describing everything she'd seen, her garden shears gesturing in the air for emphasis. The college students who'd recorded everything were already uploading their videos, which would soon go viral. "Your father is on his way," one of the agents said quietly to the teenagers. The officers visibly paled at these words. Everyone in D.C. knew the senator's reputation for fighting against law enforcement overreach. This incident would give him powerful new ammunition in that ongoing battle. The afternoon sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows across the historic Georgetown street. What had started as a routine patrol had turned into a career-defining mistake for two officers who'd acted without thinking. The brother and sister stood close together, their school blazers catching the autumn breeze, as the consequences of the officers' actions began to unfold around them. In the distance, a familiar motorcade could be seen approaching, its lights flashing. The senator was coming, and with him would come a wave of change that would reshape police procedures throughout the district. But for now, his children simply waited, showing the kind of grace under pressure that came from being raised in the spotlight of public service. The black government SUVs lined the historic Georgetown street as the senator's motorcade approached. Officer Miller and Officer Chen stood rigid, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun, as the gravity of their situation became increasingly clear. The police captain paced nearby, his phone seemingly glued to his ear as he dealt with an explosion of calls from department heads and media outlets. The crowd had doubled in size, with people spilling onto the carefully maintained lawns of nearby townhouses. Phones recorded every moment, and the quiet whispers had grown into a steady murmur of conversation. The local coffee shop was doing record business as onlookers grabbed cups to ward off the autumn chill while watching the drama unfold. "The commissioner himself is on his way," someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough for the officers to hear. Officer Chen's face, already pale, took on an almost ghostly appearance. In his 12 years on the force, the commissioner had never personally responded to a street incident. Mrs. Rodriguez had finally set down her garden shears and was now fussing over the two teenagers, brushing grass off their uniforms and offering them fresh flowers from her shop. "Your mother loves these purple ones," she said softly to the sister, trying to bring a smile to the young girl's face. The boy stood protectively near his sister, his composure remarkable for someone his age. The first news vans had arrived, reporters setting up their equipment with practiced efficiency. The coffee shop owner was already being interviewed, gesturing animatedly as he described how the scene had unfolded right in front of his establishment. "These kids come here every Tuesday for hot chocolate," he explained to the camera. "Everyone in the neighborhood knows them." A hush fell over the crowd as the senator's motorcade turned onto the street. The sleek black vehicles moved with purposeful authority, led by motorcycle escorts. The police captain straightened his uniform, visibly bracing himself for what was coming. The two officers who had caused this situation seemed to shrink into themselves, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The senator stepped out of his vehicle, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to shaping national policy. His eyes immediately found his children, checking them for any sign of distress. The father in him wanted to rush forward and embrace them, but the politician in him knew this moment required something more. The brother and sister stood a little straighter as their father approached. They'd been raised in the public eye, taught from an early age how to handle difficult situations with grace. The sister's hand found her brother's, squeezing it briefly, a private moment of solidarity amid the very public scene. "Are you both all right?" the senator asked quietly, his voice carrying both parental concern and controlled anger. The teenagers nodded, maintaining their composure even as their father's security detail formed a protective circle around them. The police captain stepped forward, already launching into what seemed like a prepared apology, but the senator held up his hand. The gesture was gentle, yet it silenced the captain more effectively than any shout could have. The crowd leaned in, phones raised, eager to capture what would happen next. "These officers," the senator said, his voice clear and measured, "stopped my children on their walk home from school. They searched their belongings without cause. They ignored their school uniforms, their IDs, and the protests of community members who knew them." He paused, letting each word land with deliberate weight. "But this isn't about my children." Mrs. Rodriguez dabbed at her eyes with her apron as the senator continued. "This is about every child who walks these streets, every teenager who gets profiled because of how they look or what they're wearing. My kids are safe because of who their father is, but what about everyone else's children?" The news cameras captured every word as the senator turned to face Officers Miller and Chen. The two men seemed to be trying to disappear into their uniforms. "You'll both be part of the solution," he said, surprising everyone. "Starting tomorrow, you're being reassigned to help develop new training protocols. We're going to turn this mistake into a lesson for every officer in the district." The police commissioner's car arrived just then, adding another layer of authority to the scene. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the historic street. The coffee shop owner quietly distributed more hot drinks to the crowd, who remained transfixed by the unfolding drama. "Dad," the brother spoke up, his voice steady. "We want to help too." His sister nodded in agreement. The senator looked at his children with pride. They'd already understood that this moment was bigger than their personal experience. The commissioner approached, looking grave, but the senator's next words changed the entire tone of the confrontation. "Commissioner, my office will be drafting new legislation about police interactions with minors. And these officers," he gestured to Miller and Chen, "will be giving testimony about what we can do better." The crowd murmured in surprise. This wasn't the angry retribution they'd expected. Instead, they were watching a masterclass in turning a crisis into an opportunity for change. The officers, who moments ago had feared for their careers, now stood straighter, realizing they were being offered a chance to make things right. As the sun continued its descent over Georgetown, casting a golden glow over the assembled crowd, what had started as a terrible mistake was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of genuine reform, sparked by two teenagers who had handled an unfair situation with remarkable grace. By nightfall, the video had spread like wildfire across social media. The evening news led with the footage, two teenagers in private school uniforms, standing dignified as police officers rifled through their backpacks on a Georgetown street. The headlines wrote themselves: "Senator's children profiled, Georgetown stop gone wrong, police overreach hits Capitol Hill." Inside the warm glow of the family's brownstone home, the brother and sister sat with their parents in the living room, watching the coverage unfold on multiple news channels. Their mother, a respected civil rights attorney, had rushed home from court when she heard the news. Now she sat close to her children, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch them, as if reassuring herself they were okay. "Look at these comments," the brother said, scrolling through his phone. "There are thousands of people sharing similar stories." His sister leaned over to look, her own phone buzzing constantly with messages from classmates and friends. The incident had struck a chord that went far beyond their personal experience. The family's home phone hadn't stopped ringing. Senators from both parties, civil rights leaders, police reform advocates, everyone wanted to speak with the senator about what had happened. His chief of staff had set up a command center in the dining room, managing the crisis that was rapidly becoming a catalyst for change. "Your father's office just received calls from 3 major news networks," their mother said, looking up from her laptop. "They all want to interview you both." She paused, studying her children's faces. "But only if you feel ready. You don't have to do this." The teenagers exchanged glances. They'd been raised understanding the weight of public service, taught that personal difficulties could sometimes serve a greater purpose. The sister spoke first, her voice quiet but determined. "If it helps other kids who don't have our privileges, we should do it." Outside, news vans still lined their street. Neighbors had been bringing food all evening. Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop had delivered her famous homemade soup, the coffee shop owner had sent over fresh pastries, and even the elderly couple next door had brought their grandmother's secret recipe casserole. It was their way of showing support, of saying they'd witnessed what happened and stood with the family. The senator's phone buzzed with a text message. "The police commissioner wants to meet tomorrow morning," he told his family. "He's suggesting a joint press conference." He looked at his children, pride evident in his eyes. They'd handled the situation with more grace than many adults would have shown. On the TV, civil rights activists were already using the incident to highlight broader issues. The footage played again, the officers ignoring the school uniforms, dismissing community members who tried to intervene, the growing crowd of witnesses with their phones raised. But it was the teenagers' composure that caught everyone's attention, their dignity in the face of unfair treatment. "Did you see this?" the brother asked, showing his phone to his sister. A student organization at their school had already organized a peaceful walkout for the next day, demanding better training for police officers who patrol near schools. The sister smiled slightly. Their classmates had always been quick to stand up for what they believed in. Their mother's laptop pinged with another email. "The Civil Rights Committee wants your father to speak at next week's session," she announced. They're fast-tracking new legislation about police interactions with minors. The senator nodded, already making notes on his tablet. This was how change happened, turning personal incidents into public policy. The doorbell rang again, another delivery of food from concerned neighbors. The family's security detail checked it carefully before bringing in a homemade apple pie from the local bakery. The note attached read simply, "We saw what happened. We stand with you." Social media continued to explode with reactions. The video had been viewed millions of times, spawning thousands of comments and shares. But unlike many viral incidents, this one was different. The senator's measured response, focusing on systematic change rather than punishment, had changed the narrative. People weren't just angry, they were motivated to create real change. The sister's phone lit up with a text from her best friend. "You're trending on Twitter, but in a good way." The teenagers couldn't help but laugh at that. It was such a modern response to such a serious situation. Their father looked up from his notes, grateful to hear them laugh despite everything that had happened. As the night grew later, the family remained together in their living room, watching as their private moment of injustice transformed into a movement for change. The brother and sister had handled their 15 minutes of unwanted fame with remarkable grace, and now that spotlight was illuminating issues that affected thousands of other young people. The last news report of the night showed officers Miller and Chen being escorted into police headquarters for their debriefing. But instead of anger, the coverage focused on the senator's innovative response, using this incident to create better training and new protocols. The officer's mistake would become a teaching moment for police departments across the country. Outside their window, the Georgetown street had finally grown quiet. The news vans had departed, the crowds had dispersed, but the impact of what had happened that afternoon was still spreading across the nation. Tomorrow would bring press conferences and policy meetings, interviews and initiatives. But for now, the family sat together, stronger for having faced this challenge with dignity and purpose. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Senate press room, casting long shadows across the polished podium. Camera crews jostled for position as reporters filled every available seat. The room buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another press conference. This was about something that had touched a nerve across the nation. The senator adjusted his tie, standing just outside the press room doors. His wife, still in her court attire, squeezed his hand supportively. Their children stood nearby, their school having given them permission to attend this important moment. The brother straightened his uniform tie, while his sister smoothed her blazer, small gestures that showed they understood the importance of appearance in these moments. "Ready?" the senator asked his family softly. They nodded, and his chief of staff opened the heavy wooden doors. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as they entered, the sound like rainfall against the marble floors. The teenagers had never been to one of their father's press conferences before, but today was different. Today, they were part of the story. The police commissioner stood to one side of the podium, along with Officers Miller and Chen. The officers looked different today, humbled but also determined. They'd spent the night helping draft new training protocols, turning their mistake into a template for change. Their presence wasn't about punishment anymore, it was about progress. "Good morning," the senator began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Yesterday, my children experienced something that happens to countless young people across our nation every day. The only difference is that my children's story made the news." He paused, letting those words sink in. A reporter's hand shot up. "Senator, are you pressing charges against the officers?" The question hung in the air, but the senator's response surprised many. "No," he said firmly. "These officers made a mistake, yes, but firing them or pressing charges won't solve the underlying problem. Instead, they've agreed to help us create something positive from this incident." He gestured for the officers to step forward. Officer Miller spoke first, his voice slightly shaky but growing stronger. "What happened yesterday opened my eyes. We're supposed to protect our community, but sometimes our assumptions and biases get in the way. That stops now." Officer Chen nodded in agreement, adding, "We want to be part of the solution." The senator's daughter raised her hand hesitantly. Her father nodded, encouraging her to speak. She stepped to the microphone, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "Yesterday was scary," she admitted. "But what scared me most wasn't what happened to us. It was knowing that this happens to other kids who don't have the protection of a famous parent." Her brother joined her at the podium. "We've received thousands of messages since yesterday," he added. "Stories from other students, from parents, from people across the country who've had similar experiences. They deserve to be heard too." The room fell silent as the teenagers spoke. These weren't rehearsed political statements. This was raw, honest truth from young people who'd experienced injustice firsthand. Reporters scribbled frantically, knowing they were witnessing something unique in political theater, genuine authenticity. The police commissioner stepped forward next, announcing immediate changes to department policy. "Starting today, all officers will undergo new training for interactions with minors. Officers Miller and Chen will help develop this training, sharing their experience to prevent similar incidents." From the back of the room, Mrs. Rodriguez and the coffee shop owner watched proudly. They'd been invited as community representatives, their presence a reminder that change happens when communities stand together. The flower shop owner dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she watched her young neighbors handle themselves with such maturity. "But this isn't just about police training," the senator continued. "This is about creating a society where every child feels safe in their own neighborhood, where wearing a hoodie doesn't make you suspicious, and where the color of your skin doesn't determine how you're treated by law enforcement." His wife stepped to the podium then, her legal background adding weight to her words. "We're drafting legislation that will require new protocols for any police interaction with minors. This will include mandatory body camera usage, parent notification requirements, and clear guidelines for when searches can be conducted." The teenager's school principal, watching the broadcast from his office, smiled proudly. He'd already incorporated the incident into next week's civics lessons, a real-world example of how citizen engagement could create positive change. As questions flew from reporters, the family stood together, presenting a united front. They weren't just talking about change, they were showing how to create it. The officers who had made the mistake stood ready to help fix the system. The community members who had witnessed the incident were now part of the solution. Outside the press room, students from local schools had gathered, holding signs supporting police reform. The brother and sister's classmates had organized a peaceful demonstration, turning their anger into action. It was a reminder that young people often led the way in pushing for social change. The senator concluded the press conference with a powerful statement. "Yesterday could have ended differently. We could have demanded punishment. Instead, we're demanding progress, because real change doesn't come from tearing people down, it comes from building better systems together." As the cameras continued to roll, capturing this moment for evening news broadcasts across the country, something remarkable was happening. A potential scandal was transforming into a movement for positive change, led by two teenagers who had chosen dignity over anger, and a father who saw an opportunity to make a difference. 3 months after the Georgetown incident, the Senate hearing room was packed to capacity. Sunlight filtered through the historic windows, illuminating the polished wood panels and marble columns. The brother and sister sat in the front row, watching their father prepare to introduce groundbreaking legislation that had grown from their experience. The teenage boy smoothed his tie, the same one he'd worn on that autumn afternoon, while his sister adjusted her blazer. They'd grown in these past months, not just in height but in purpose. Their school newspaper lay folded on the seat between them, featuring their latest article about youth advocacy and police reform. The Police Youth Protection Act, the senator began, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber, was born from a personal experience. But it's shaped by thousands of stories from across our nation. He gestured to a stack of letters on his desk, testimonies from young people who'd faced similar situations but lacked the protection of a powerful parent. Officer Miller and Officer Chen sat a few rows back, dressed in their formal uniforms. They'd spent the past months helping develop new training programs, turning their mistake into a teaching tool. The older officer caught the boy's eye and nodded respectfully, a small gesture that spoke volumes about how far they'd all come. Mrs. Rodriguez, the flower shop owner, had closed her store for the day to attend. She sat with other community members who'd witnessed the original incident, including the coffee shop owner who'd first called the media. They'd become unexpected advocates for change, their testimony about that day helping to shape the new legislation. In the past 3 months, the senator continued, we've seen remarkable changes in our district. Officered youth interactions are down 40%. Unnecessary searches have decreased by 60%. But most importantly, trust is being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. The police commissioner nodded from his seat, remembering the tense meetings in those first days after the incident. What could have been a career-ending scandal had instead become a model for police reform across the country. Other cities were already requesting copies of their new training protocols. The sister opened her laptop, adding to the document she'd been maintaining since that day. It was filled with stories from other young people, some hopeful, some heartbreaking, all important. She'd started collecting them as a way to process her own experience, but it had grown into something bigger. Next month, she'd be presenting their findings at a national youth leadership conference. This legislation isn't just about protecting our children, the senator explained, gesturing toward his family. It's about teaching them that when something unfair happens, they have the power to create positive change. His wife smiled from her seat, still remembering how their children had insisted on being part of the solution rather than simply moving on. The brother pulled out his phone, checking the latest statistics from their school's new student advocacy group. What had started as a response to that incident had grown into a powerful voice for young people across the city. They'd organized forums, created a reporting system for student-police interactions, and built bridges between law enforcement and local youth. Officer Chen stepped to the podium next, her testimony carrying the weight of personal experience. 3 months ago, I made a mistake based on assumptions and bias, she admitted. Today, I teach other officers how to avoid those same mistakes. But more importantly, I learn from the young people in our community every day. The local news crews filmed quietly from the back of the room. This wasn't just another political story, it was about real change happening at the community level. The camera panned across the faces in the room. Teenagers who'd found their voice, officers learning to serve better, community members standing up for what's right. The true measure of this legislation, the senator concluded, won't be in statistics or reports. It will be in the stories we don't hear. The confrontations that don't happen, the assumptions that don't get made, the young lives that don't get derailed by unnecessary interactions with law enforcement. As the vote was called, the brother and sister held hands tightly. They thought back to that autumn afternoon on the Georgetown street, how frightened and angry they'd felt. Now that moment of injustice had sparked a movement that would protect thousands of other young people. The legislation passed with bipartisan support. As applause filled the chamber, Mrs. Rodriguez wiped happy tears from her eyes. The coffee shop owner hugged the teenagers, remembering how he brought them hot chocolate to calm their nerves 3 months ago. Now they were all part of history. Outside the Capitol, a group of students from their school held up supportive signs. The brother and sister waved, remembering how their classmates had rallied around them from the very beginning. Young voices had been crucial in shaping this legislation, proving that age was no barrier to creating meaningful change. As the family walked down the Capitol steps together, reporters called out questions. But the teenagers weren't focused on the cameras anymore. They were watching a group of young people their age walking past the Capitol, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughing and talking freely, exactly as it should be. The autumn incident that could have ended in anger and recrimination had instead become a catalyst for positive change. 2 teenagers who could have been victims had become leaders. 2 officers who could have been villains had become teachers, and 1 community had shown the nation how to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for progress.